Mic check. Mic check.
So apologies for the sounds. I don't know what was happening, but we fixed the same. Thank you, Sinovia, for letting me know that I didn't have sound. I was out here having a show on my own. So I was talking about Ethiopia and how it had to float its currency in order to secure a loan from the IMF. And I was explaining on why the IMF made it a requirement that Ethiopia must float. Please let me know if you can hear me now, Sinovia. So I was explaining why. Oh, okay. I was explaining why Ethiopia had to float its currency in order for the IMF to approve a loan, to approve its loan. So floating a currency is the scenario where a country is forced not to intervene in how its currency operates. You know, for example, if the Kenyan shilling is at 130 in exchange for the USD, then the government might not want it to go below that a certain level, especially for third world countries. That is very important because most third world countries, most African countries to be specific, are high importing countries. They don't produce anything. They don't produce enough exports. They import more than they export. So it's very, very important for those countries for the currencies of those countries to be a bit stronger because they need to convert their currency into the US dollar in order to buy the imports. And when I talk about a country like Ethiopia, I look at a country like Ethiopia, it has been going through quite some economic woes. One, it's going through a war. Two, it has famine happening at the moment. Three, it has inflation hitting the highest for the the inflation in Ethiopia haven't hit this high for quite some time. And Ethiopia is not a secluded case. It's the same in Nigeria. It's been the same case in Ghana. It's been the same case in Egypt. It's been the same case in Kenya too for some time. So now Ethiopia had to go to the IMF like most African countries do when they get into economic woes. Why? Because, as I told you, they don't really produce anything of value that they can take into the international, apart from maybe the minerals that they are stolen, they are not really sold as they should be. So for a country like Ethiopia Ethiopia relies on its coffee. So it had to go to the IMF to look for what is called debt restructuring support. And the IMF gave its condition. It said, if you want us to give you a loan, then you have to float your currency. And as I was explaining, floating a currency for an African country, for a third world country, has its merits and demerits, but more on the demerit side, because once you float your currency, it means now the currency's value is going to be determined by the market price. I'm putting it in quotes because it's never really the market price. So it's a supply and demand curve type of situation where now the demand for your currency is what's going to determine its value. So several African countries have made the mistake Ethiopia is making of floating their currency with advice from the IMF, with advice from World Bank, with advice from their Ivy League economic advisors. Ethiopia did the same. You know what happened in Ethiopia when Nigeria did the same. You see what is happening in Nigeria at the moment. Everything is falling downwards. Things are falling apart as per Chinua Achebe in Nigeria because of the same. Where as a country that does not have export value, then floating your currency is really not a good idea, because at least if you have low export value, if you're exporting less, whatever you're exporting, let it be high value, so that your export value, because how they measure, how they determine how the strength of your currency, the GDP, the NNP, that is the net national product, is determined, is mostly from what is your export value in comparison to your import value. And the truth is, in most African countries, the export value is negligible. For a country like Ethiopia, negligible. All the export is coffee. and they export it as raw berries, so very low quality, very low value coffee. In exchange, they import everything else. They import food to eat, they import electronics, they import herbicides, pesticides for their coffee. So if Ethiopia floats its currency like it did today, what happened is the Ethiopian currency lost value by 30%, because nobody wants it's called the beer. Nobody wants the Ethiopian beer. What for? Ethiopia does not really offer anything in the international market apart from its coffee berries, which are low value. So that is going to, of course, the effect that may, the only people that may benefit from this are importers themselves. And I'll explain why importers are going to benefit. But the consumers, that is the normal citizens in a country, when the currency gets devalued, they're the ones who get affected. So the reason the importers are going to benefit is because nothing is really going to change for them. They're still going to import whatever they import at, even if the price goes up. Then as an importer, if I import food to Ethiopia, I'm still going to import the food to Ethiopia. I know I'm going to import it at high costs, but of course what I'm going to do in the supply chain, in the business supply chain, what happens is you always pass the burden to the next person in the chain. So as an importer, I import food products, electronics at high costs, high prices. I'm gonna pass the burden to the distributor. The distributor will pass the burden to the retailer. The retailer will be like, oh, I got this food at expensive prices. I'm gonna pass the burden to the consumer. Who's the consumer going to pass the burden to? Nobody. So the person who gets affected by such is in fact the final consumer is the one who's always affected when a country floats its currency, and that reflects in the economy immediately, because the cost and the price of everything goes up, and now you can't even afford basic commodities like medicine, like sanitary pads for women, like electronics, like food. And now you're left with your coffee, which you're selling at very low prices because your currency is devalued. And now the money you receive from your coffee is not even enough to feed you. That is the IMF's plan, the IMF's playbook. We're going to give you loans, but you have to devalue your currency first, so that the loans we give you are not going to help you. And we're going to give you, for example, in the Ethiopian case, Ethiopia is receiving about 10 billion USD. And so this is how it's not even going to help the poor of Ethiopia in any way, because one, the loans have been given in US dollars, and the Ethiopian government will have to convert the same to Ethiopian birr in order for it to facilitate trade in Ethiopia. That is, if some of the money is going towards paying government employees, they're not going to be paid in US dollars. It will have to be converted to Ethiopian currency, the birr. So because the US dollar value in comparison to the birr is heaven and earth, and the Ethiopian currency is called the birr, has been devalued, then the government of Ethiopia will lose a lot of the money. Will lose. They're going to lose as they are converting the money to the birr. After they have converted the money to the birr, facilitated whatever was supposed to be facilitated, stolen what was supposed to be stolen. You know what happens in these countries? The government of Ethiopia will have to repay back the 10 billion that it was given. It's not going to repay the same in birrs, is it? It will have to convert it again to US dollars in order to repay back. So it ends up converting the money twice. One, to facilitate trade in their country, and two, to repay the loans. So they're going to lose money value as they are converting it for the first time and as they are converting it for the second time. So they end up receiving 10 billion from the IMF and paying back 18. Remember, I've not factored in interest rates, which are going to be in US dollars, even though the money is operating in the Ethiopian currency, which they have devalued. So you find out that you end up finding out that a government took a 10 billion loan, but it's paying 30 for the same loan. And of the 10 billion, 8 were stolen, 8 were, 2 were put into white elephant projects as per the confessions of the economic hitman. They were told to build, I don't know, solar powered projects and a lot of white elephant projects to just uh, it's more of economic imperialism. It's never for help, and they make sure that the money they give you is not going to benefit you in a way. If it was going to benefit Ethiopia, for example, the reason they are in this economic turmoil at the moment is because they defaulted on their loans last year. They didn't have enough money to pay previous loans, and so of course, the Ethiopian government, with its Ivy League economic advisors, sits down and asks itself this question. We have loans that we've not paid in a while. What are we going to do? And they agree, let us borrow more to pay the loans. And then for this one, we are also going to borrow again to pay this one. And then for that one, we'll borrow again for this one. So you end up now borrowing to pay debts, and then borrowing again to pay the debt that you borrowed to pay the debt. That is African mathematics for you. That is African maths. That is what they always do. And I wrote on the headline, Ethiopia forced to float currency, because that was not by mistake, it was deliberate, because they were forced. The IMF said that unless you float your currency, we're not giving you loans. Not the first time they've done this. They've done this in Egypt. They've done this in Nigeria, where they force you to devalue your currency. And mark you, when you devalue your currency, you've devalued your whole country. Like everything else operates from that, especially for high importing countries. If you are a country that was self-reliant, you can produce your own food, you can make your own electronics, then it doesn't matter what your currency looks like, the value of your currency. But for high importing countries and in a trading world, the value of your currency matters, and matters a lot. Let nobody not lie to you that the value of your currency doesn't matter. It does, because it's going to reflect on the price of commodities in your country, from all the commodities. So that was what was happening. I'm sorry I didn't have sound for the first few minutes of my show. Some technical unavoidable problems, but a big shout out to Sinovia for letting me know, and a big shout out to Ikan Fire for joining me. Today we're talking about how Ethiopia is being forced into economic reforms by the IMF, economic reforms that saw Ghana plunge down, that saw Nigeria headed the same route, that saw Egypt headed the same route. I don't know how they don't see this, because that is the first step towards now fully, most African countries are dependent on Bretton Woods. But now this is the route to fully dependency, where if the Bretton Woods do not approve, for example, a certain loan for you, it's over for you. Like, you fully dependent on them. Right now, most African countries are dependent. For example, I could say a country like Uganda is dependent on the IMF, on the Bretton Woods. That means if the Bretton Woods refuse to give the Uganda a loan, Uganda would still operate even without the loans. Only that maybe for some time before they adapt to living without the loans, they might face a few economic challenges. But now when you go the Ethiopian route, the Ghanaian route, the Nigerian route, now you become fully dependent on the Bretton Woods. That is, if they don't give you a loan, you're done with. Because now you fully, all the money that you bring into your country, all the revenue that you earn as a country, you send it to them to repay your debts. So that means if they don't give you more debts, and all the money that you collect as a country, you're sending it to them, then you're left with nothing. So now you're paying, but if they don't give it back to you, so now you collect money, you give it to them, then they give it back to you. That's what is happening in this country. I collect my taxes, revenue, import value from my coffee and my minerals, I give it to the IMF, then the IMF gives it back to me. So if I give it to them and they don't give it back to me, I'm paralyzed. I can't operate anymore. Economic breakdown. So that is the path that these countries are heading, and I don't know. I really don't know, because that's where they're headed to. They're headed on that direction, where they'll now have to like Sinovia is saying, they'll have to operate in a mafia-like way. The IMF sounds like the mafia. So that is one of the biggest mistake an African country can do, float its currency. I was explaining, somebody might ask then, how come Kenya floated its currency and it looks like it's doing better as I finish the show? Kenya did float its currency, and that it reflected positively on the currency exchange. And you might wonder why is Kenya and Nigeria floated their currency at around the same time, but the Kenyan currency gained value, the Kenya shilling gained value by about 20-30%. It gained from, the US dollar was devalued from 160 to 130, but the opposite was seen in Nigeria, the opposite was seen in Ghana. So you might wonder, why is it selective? How come Kenya floated its currency and it worked for them? Well, it doesn't mean Kenya is a high exporting country. It doesn't export anything really apart from tea and raw coffee, the same as Ethiopia. The only reason the Kenyan one worked was because they had a loan maturing, and really the reason the Kenyan currency had gotten devalued, then you have to look at the context. The reason the Kenyan shilling had gotten so devalued to a point that it was almost 200 bob for $1, 200 Kenya shillings for $1, was because what was happening was artificial deficiency of dollars, what is called hoarding. So the rich people in the country, I'm using the rich people for lack of a better word, know when the government is going, for example, to pay a certain debt. And in this case, Kenya was about to pay a certain bond called the Euro bond. They had taken a loan many years ago. It was maturing this year. It was this year. So it was maturing this year. So Kenya needed to pay the Euro bond this year because it had matured. It's a bond. It was maturing. A bond matures, and it has to be paid when it matures. And the Kenyan government cannot pay for the Euro bond in Kenya shillings. It has to pay for the same in either euros or USD. It has to convert. If it has the money in its central bank or in its exchequer account, it has to convert the same in USD or Euro bond. So certain powerful entities in the government sometimes know that the government is going to be desperately looking for dollars in order to pay back the debts, the bonds. And so they buy in bulk. They go to banks and they buy all the dollars in bulk and they put it in their houses. That is hoarding. What that creates is an artificial shortage of the dollars. And you know the supply and demand curve. If something is in high demand but in low supply, its value goes up because more people want it, but it's very less in the market. That was what was happening in Kenya. People had bought dollars in bulk, hidden them in their homes, in the hopes that the government is going to go into panic buying when it comes to paying the Euro bond. But unfortunately for them, the government got another debt. Another debt was approved to pay the Euro bond. And so the government was confident when it floated its currency, and it worked for the government. It worked in the positive, really. That is why the Kenya shillings is still powerful right now. It's at 130 130 to the USD. That's pretty powerful. One Kenya shillings is about 40 Ugandan shilling at the moment, so that is a bit on the high side. So now the government got another debt and it repaid the Euro bond. So that busted the bubble that people who had hoarded the dollars had, that the government was going to go into panic buying in order to pay the Euro bond, because now the Euro bond has already been paid they took a debt to pay the Euro bond. So now everybody who had the dollar released them into the market, because why would I hold them anymore? And I know the government already paid the debt which I had bought them in order to sell when it was paying. So now when everybody released the dollars into the market, the dollars were in high supply and low demand. Nobody, in as much as we want the dollar, now the government does not need them as much to pay the debts because the debt has already been paid. So now it was in high supply but low demand. So the US dollar went down and the Kenya shilling went up. So that is why the Kenyan one worked. And it's not going to work in Ethiopia, because in Ethiopia, it was not a case of artificial shortage. It was not a case of hoarding. It's a case of corruption. It's a case of low export value. It's a case of uninformed economic reforms, it's a case of economic imperialism that has been imposed on them. So floating the currency won't work like it did in Kenya. It won't work in Nigeria, because in Nigeria it's the same. It's the case of high insecurity to a point that people are no longer productive, so they can't be able to produce anything to export because the Boko Haram is there killing people, and now I can't even go to my farm to plant anything, any crops to export. It's a case of Nigeria does not really export anything apart from its oil, which the money goes to a few hands, and it has to import everything, including oil. Nigeria exports oil, then imports from a different country. It's that it exports its oil at low value, then imports at high value. Like, here is my oil, I'll give it to you at throwaway prices, then give it to me in a month's time at high prices. I'll buy it. Nigerian maths. So as I come to the end of the show, that was all I had. A big shout out to Sinovia, a big shout out to Week and Fire, a big shout out to everybody else who was with me. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. It's always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen. Much love.